Welcome to another episode of the Soothing Semantics podcast. I'm your host, Rafi Pinsky. Make sure to subscribe, like, share, smash the comments, smash the like button, just smash things. It is a pleasure to be here. For all of your real estate needs in South Florida, make sure to follow me on Instagram at Rafi_the_realtor and check out the link in bio where I have my weekly newsletter so you can stay up to date on everything real estate in South Florida. Without further ado, we have Samuel J. Hyde, okay? No relation to Dr. Jekyll.
Nothing. But, apparently maybe he's a cousin, third cousin, twice removed or something like that. Yeah. Shh. Don't tell anyone.
Okay, so yes. Okay. Well, I guess Dr. Finkelstein will be today's Dr. Jekyll.
Oh, that's
nonetheless. Oh, so ladies and gents, before you watch this episode, I highly suggest you watch the episode that Sam and I did 2 weeks ago. It was really, really great. I had an awesome time. I got really great feedback on it. So before you guys check this episode out, just to get a little bit of a better idea on how both of us see the conflict, make sure to check that out. So, Sam, thank you again for joining. Really happy and appreciate you taking the time.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, guys, just to give you a bit of context, if you don't know, Sam is a political researcher and writer. He is based in Tel Aviv, a fellow Hyde. You can find him at Samuel Joshua Hyde on Instagram. Click the link in his bio, the link tree in his bio to read his Substack. He's written many articles on the conflict. Quite an intelligent young man, and we are going to give our commentary and our thoughts on the recent Lex Fridman debate, where Lex Fridman was the moderator, and we had Dr. Norman Finkelstein, Muin Rabbani. So Dr. Morgan, see, I'm getting his name wrong. Norman Finkelstein is a Jewish American, quite anti-Israel, very critical of Israel. I mean, I don't know how. I don't know if I would say, well, no, he's pretty anti-Israel, man. If we're being honest.
Yeah, I mean, he's written some books called the Holocaust Industry. I'd say he's got a little bit of internal. I'd even go as far as saying he's got internalized anti-Semitism, nonetheless, an anti-Israel stance on things.
Yeah, for sure. Muin Rabbani is a Palestinian American. I don't know that much about Muin, to be honest. Do a little more research on him. He didn't really speak that much in the debate. He definitely spoke, but he spoke the least. Then you have Destiny, who that's just his alias. He's a streamer. He speaks quite a lot of politics. I happen to think he's actually pretty knowledgeable on the subject. He definitely doesn't know all that much because he hasn't been studying for that long. But considering how long he's been studying it, I think I'm impressed by how much he knows. And then we have Benny Morris also, who's written several books, Israeli gentleman, knows quite a lot about the conflict. So this is a very interesting episode. Sam and I watched it on our own prior to checking it out now, and we're going to give our commentary, do some impressions. Sam does quite a solid Dr. Norman Finkelstein impression. So, guys, I hope you enjoy the laughs. I hope you enjoy our commentary. Here we go.
1948. For Israelis, 1948 is the establishment of the State of Israel and the War of Independence. For Palestinians, 1948 is the Nakba, which means catastrophe, or the displacement of 700,000 Palestinians from their homes as a consequence of the war. What to you is important to understand about the events of 1948 and the period around there, 47, 49, that helps us understand what's going on today, and maybe helps us understand the roots of all this that started even before 1948. I was hoping that Norm can speak first, and Benny, then Wayne, and then Norm.
After World War II, the British decided that they didn't want to deal with the Palestine question anymore, and the ball was thrown into the court of the United Nations. Now, as I read the record, the UN was not attempting to arbitrate or adjudicate rights and wrongs. It was confronting a very practical problem. There were two national communities in Palestine, and there were irreconcilable differences on fundamental questions, most importantly, looking at the historic record on the question of immigration, and associate with the question of immigration, the question of land. The UN Special Committee on Palestine which came into being before the UN 181 partition resolution, the UN Special Committee, it recommended 2 states in Palestine. There was a minority position represented by Iran, India, Yugoslavia. They supported 1 state, but they believed that if forced to, the 2 communities would figure out some sort of modus vivendi and live together. The United Nations General Assembly supported partition between what it called a Jewish state and an Arab state. Now, in my reading of the record, and I understand there's new scholarship in the subject, which I've not read, but so far as I've read the record, there's no clarity on what the United Nations General Assembly meant by a Jewish state and an Arab state, except for the fact that the Jewish state would be demographically, the majority would be Jewish, and the Arab state demographically would be Arab. The UNSCOP, the UN Special Committee in Palestine, it was very clear, and it was reiterated many times, that in recommending 2 states, each state, the Arab state and the Jewish state, would have to guarantee full equality of all citizens with regard to political, civil, and religious matters. Now, that does raise the question, if there is absolute full equality of all citizens, both in the Jewish state and the Arab state, with regard to political rights, civil rights, and religious rights, apart from the demographic majority, it's very unclear what it meant to call a state Jewish or call a state Arab. In my view, the partition resolution was the correct decision. I do not believe that the Arab and Jewish communities could, at that point, be made to live together. I disagree with the minority position of India, Iran, and Yugoslavia. And that not being a practical option, 2 states was the only other option. In this regard, I would want to pay tribute to what was probably the most moving speech at the UN General Assembly proceedings by the Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko. I was very tempted to quote it at length, but I recognized that would be taking too much time. So I asked a young friend, Jamie Stern-Weiner, to edit it and just get the essence of what Foreign Minister Gromyko had to say. During the last war, Gromyko said, the Jewish people underwent exceptional sorrow and suffering. Without any exaggeration, this sorrow and suffering are indescribable. Hundreds of thousands of Jews are wandering about in various countries of Europe in search of means of existence and in search of shelter. The United Nations cannot and must not regard this situation with indifference. Past experience, particularly during the Second World War, shows that no Western European state was able to provide adequate assistance for the Jewish people in defending its rights and its very existence from the violence of the Hitlerites and their allies. This is an unpleasant fact, but unfortunately, like all other facts, it must be admitted. Gromyko went on to say, in principle, he supports 1 state, or the Soviet Union supports 1 state, but he said, if relations between the Jewish and Arab populations of Palestine proved to be so bad that it would be impossible to reconcile them and to ensure the peaceful coexistence of the Arabs and the Jews, the Soviet Union would support 2 states. I personally am not convinced that the 2 states would have been unsustainable in the long term if, and this is a big if, the Zionist movement had been faithful to the position it proclaimed during the UNSCOP public hearings. At the time, Ben-Gurion testified, quote, I want to express what we mean by a Jewish state. We mean by a Jewish state simply a state where the majority of the people are Jews, not a state where a Jew has in any way, any privilege more than anyone else. A Jewish state means a state based on absolute equality of all her citizens and on democracy. Alas, this was not to be. As Professor Morris has written, quote, Zionist ideology and practice were necessarily and elementally expansionist. And then he wrote in another book, transfer, the euphemism for expulsion, transfer was inevitable and inbuilt into Zionism because it sought to transform a land which was Arab into a Jewish state. And a Jewish state could not have arisen without a major displacement of Arab population. And because this aim automatically produced resistance among the Arabs, which in turn persuaded the Yeshuv's leaders, the Yeshuv being the Jewish community, the Yeshuv's leaders that a hostile Arab majority or large minority could not remain in place if a Jewish state was to arise or safely endure. Or, as Professor Morris retrospectively put it, quote, a removing of a population was needed. Without a population expulsion, a Jewish state would not have been established, unquote. The Arab side rejected outright the partition resolution. I won't play games with that. I know a lot of people try to prove it's not true. It clearly, in my view, is true. The Arab side rejected outright the partition resolution, while Israeli leaders, acting under compulsions inevitable and inbuilt into Zionism, found a pretext in the course of the First Arab-Israeli War to expel the indigenous population and expand its borders. I therefore conclude that neither side was committed to the letter of the partition resolution, and both sides aborted it.
Thank you, Norm. Norm asked that we make a lengthy statement at the beginning. Benny, I hope it's okay to call everybody by their first name in the name of camaraderie. Norm has quoted several things you said. Perhaps you can comment broadly on the question of 1948 and maybe respond to the things that Norm said.
Yeah. UNSCOP, the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, recommended partition. The majority of UNSCOP recommended partition, which was accepted by the UN General Assembly in November 1947. Essentially, looking back to the Peel Commission in 1937, 10 years earlier, a British commission had looked at the problem of Palestine, the two warring national groups who refused to live together, if you like, or consolidate a unitary state between them. And Peel said there should be two states. That's the principle. The country must be partitioned into two states. This would give a modicum of justice to both sides, if not all their demands, of course. And the United Nations followed suit. The United Nations, UNSCOP, and then the UN General Assembly, representing the will of the international community, said two states is the just solution in this complex situation. The problem was that immediately with the passage of the resolution, the Arab states and the Arabs of Palestine said no, as Norman Finkelstein said. They said no, they rejected the partition idea, the principle of partition, not just the idea of what percentage which side should get, but the principle of partition. They said no to the Jews should not have any part of Palestine for their sovereign territory. Maybe Jews could live as a minority in Palestine. That also was problematic in the eyes of the Palestinian Arab leadership. Hussein had said only Jews who were there before 1917 could actually get citizenship and continue to live there. But the Arabs rejected partition, and the Arabs of Palestine launched, in very disorganized fashion, war against the resolution, against the implementation of the resolution, against the Jewish community in Palestine. And this was their defeat in that civil war between the two communities, while the British were...
It's crazy how much faster Benny speaks.
In comparison to Norman?
Oh my God. Like at double speed, he's flying. And at Norman, it's almost not even that fast.
Well, because Norman loves drama, so he takes a lot of dramatic pauses.
Withdrawing from Palestine led to the Arab invasion, by the Arab states in May 1948 of the country. Again, basically with the idea of eradicating or preventing the emergence of a Jewish state in line with the United Nations decision and the will of the international community. Norman said that the Zionist enterprise, and he quoted me, meant from the beginning to transfer or expel the Arabs of Palestine, or some of the Arabs of Palestine. And I think he's sort of quoting out of context. The context in which the statements were made that the Jewish state could only emerge if there was a transfer of Arab population was preceded, in the way I wrote it and the way it actually happened, by Arab resistance and hostilities towards the Jewish community. Had the Arabs accepted partition, there would have been a large Arab minority in the Jewish state, which emerged in 47. And in fact, Jewish economists and state builders took into account that there would be a large Arab minority and its needs would be cared for, etc. But this was not to be, because Arabs attacked. And had they not attacked, perhaps a Jewish state with a large Arab minority could have emerged, but this didn't happen. They went to war, the Jews resisted, and in the course of that war, Arab populations were driven out. Some were expelled, some left because Arab leaders advised them to leave or ordered them to leave. And at the end of the war, Israel said they can't return because they just tried to destroy the Jewish state. And that's the basic reality of what happened in 48.
Yeah, I want to say, if I can,
Can you hear me?
yeah, I lost you there for a little bit, but I want to say two things on what Benny said. He mentions two very important points here in his rebuttal of Finkelstein. What he's essentially saying by, that there was certain displacements, some left on their own as a result of war, as what we're seeing happening now, for example, in Israel. We saw as a result of the Hamas attack, we see that there's 150,000 people internally displaced. So what he's basically saying is that there was no policy of expulsion or policy of transfer. These things happened as a result of a war, and if there was no Arab attack and there was an acceptance of partition, the key thing is, he says that the Zionists, which they were, and they'd stated on the record multiple times, and in practice by their acceptance of partition, were willing to actually accept a very large Arab minority. Today, the Arab minorities 20%. It was going to look at about 40% was going to be the minority in the way in which it was split. If you look at where people were living and the numbers, so I think Benny's point here is very interesting. But I think by the nature of the question of it being, starting 47, 48. I think what people forget is the minute we go into this conversation, people immediately remove the historical context of these events. Remember, this is around about this time, there's some 100 new countries that are born. It's the birth of the principle of self-determination, meaning the colonial empires dissolve and we see the birth of nation states. The world becomes divided into nation states. Some 100 new countries are born, Israel among them, could have been Palestine among them as well. What really is unique about this war and about the situation is not that there was a war or that there were displacements, there were also Jewish displacements from certain parts of the land. 1% of the Jewish population was displaced as a result of 1947, 1948. That often goes unaccounted for. But what I'll say is this: what is unique about the case between the Arabs of Palestine and the Jews of Israel is particularly the point in principle that the Palestinians were the only national movement to predicate their independence off the rejection of another. When you look at the 100 other countries that come around based on this principle of a nation state, the Palestinians are unique in that sense, that they rejected partition based on the total rejection of a national project of another group of people. That is completely unique. As I don't want to say this again, but you had 100 countries coming up at that time, from Latin America all the way through Asia to Africa to even parts of Europe, certainly throughout the Middle East. The Palestinians were the only people to predicate their future of the rejection of another people. That's what makes the situation unique.
Right. Yeah. They just did not want a Jewish state, although they never had one themselves. That's kind of the most interesting thing.
Well, you had two people living on the Mandate, obviously, from 1917, the British Mandate, and before that you had the Turkish Empire, and then a bunch of other rulers before that. But it doesn't really become a question of did the Palestinians have a state before or not. It really becomes a question of what is the global reality of the time, and that's the fall of empires and the birth of nation states. Each peoples that see themselves as a national group are enshrined with the right of self-determination, but also the responsibility of sovereignty. The Palestinians, historically, from 1937, from the Peel Commission, which Morris mentions, right up until the 2008 Olmert offer, have sought self-determination for themselves without the responsibility of sovereignty, without essentially looking to assume the responsibility that comes with sovereignty. And the responsibility that comes with sovereignty is not vehemently attacking your neighbors. And it's also accepting that there will be another state living next door you.
That's very, very astute. Yeah. By the way, it's also pretty damn cool that we're doing this while the solar eclipse is going down, at least in my side of the world.
Oh, not on my side of the world. It's late at night here already. It's 10 to 10. It's been raining, was raining. But it's possible. I'm very bad with these things. Sometimes I find this is the first I hear of it. I'm very bad at these.
Yeah, me neither. I'm never involved in it.
It's very possible that it's happening and I'm just totally unaware of it.
Yeah, it's supposed to be going down right now. I'm not gonna listen. This is just a lot more important to me than the solar eclipse. I just don't. For me, I don't see the hype. I think it's very. I'm saying I don't know that much about it. I understand the concept. The moon kind of covers the sun, but maybe this is some kind of spiritual thing. Hopefully, this video will reach a lot of people. So we'll call this the solar eclipse discussion, the solar eclipse debate or commentary. So hopefully it'll have some nice spiritual hoo-ha in conjunction. All right, so now we continue.
For that reason, they have no state to this day. The Jews do have a state because they prepared to establish a state, fought for it, and established it, hopefully lastingly.
When you say hostility, in case people are not familiar, there was a full-on war where Arab states invaded, and Israel won that war.
Let me just add to clarify. The war had two parts to it. The first part was the Arab community in Palestine, its militiamen, attacked the Jews from November 1947. In other words, from the day after the UN partition resolution was passed, Arab gunmen were busy shooting up Jews, and that snowballed into a full-scale civil war between the two communities in Palestine. In May 1948, a second stage began in the war in which the Arab states invaded the new state, attacked the new state, and they too were defeated, and thus a state of Israel emerged. In the course of this two-stage war, a vast Palestinian refugee problem occurred.
And so after that, the transfer, the expulsion, the thing that people call the Nakba happened. William, could you speak to 1948 and the historical significance of it?
Sure. There's a lot to unpack here. I'll try to limit myself to just a few points regarding Zionism and transfer. I think Chaim Weizmann, the head of the World Zionist Organization, had it exactly right when he said that the objective of Zionism is to make Palestine as Jewish as England is English or France is French.
I don't know if you noticed Norman Finkelstein's serious acid reflux about 10 seconds ago.
In other words, as Norman explained, a Jewish state requires Jewish political, demographic, and territorial supremacy. Without those three elements, the state would be Jewish in name only. And I think what distinguishes Zionism is its insistence, supremacy, and exclusivity. That would be my first point. The second point is, I think what the Soviet foreign minister at the time, Andrei Gromyko, said is exactly right, with one reservation. Gromyko was describing a European savagery unleashed against Europe's Jews. At the time, it wasn't Palestinians or Arabs. The savages and the barbarians were European to the core. It had nothing to do with developments in Palestine or the Middle East. Secondly, at the time that Gromyko was speaking, those Jewish survivors of the Holocaust and others who were in need of safe haven were still overwhelmingly on the European continent and not in Palestine. And I think, given the scale of the savagery, I don't think that any one state or country should have borne the responsibility for addressing this crisis. I think it should have been an international responsibility. Soviet Union could have contributed. Germany certainly could and should have contributed. The United Kingdom and the United States, which slammed their doors shut to the persecuted Jews of Europe as the Nazis were rising to power, they certainly should have played a role. But instead, what passed for the international community at the time decided to partition Palestine. And here I think we need to judge the partition resolution against the realities that obtained at the time. Two-thirds of the population of Palestine was Arab. The Yishuv, the Jewish community in Palestine, constituted about 1/3 of the total population and controlled even less of the land within Palestine. As a preeminent Palestinian historian, Walid al-Khalidi has pointed out, the partition resolution, in giving roughly 55% of Palestine to the Jewish community, and I think 42% to the Arab community, to the Palestinians, did not preserve the position of each community or even favor one community at the expense of the others. Rather, it thoroughly inverted and revolutionized the relationship between the two communities. And as many have written, the Nakba was the inevitable consequence of partition, given the nature of Zionism, given the territorial disposition, given the weakness of the Palestinian community, whose leadership had been largely decimated during a major revolt at the end of the 1930s, given that the Arab states were still very much under French and British influence. The Nakba was the inevitable product of the partition resolution. And one last point also about the UN's partition resolution is, yes, formally that is what the international community decided on the 29th of November 1947. It's not a resolution that could ever have gotten through the UN General Assembly today for a very simple reason. It was a very different General Assembly. Most African, most Asian states were not yet independent. Were the resolution to be placed before the international community today, and I find it telling that the minority opinion was led by India, Iran, and Yugoslavia, I think they would have represented the clear majority. So partition, given what we know about Zionism, given that it was entirely predictable what would happen, given the realities on the ground in Palestine, was deeply unjust. And the idea that either the Palestinians or the Arab states could have accepted such a resolution is I think, an illusion. That was in 1947. We saw what happened in 48 and 49. Palestinian society was essentially destroyed. Over 80%, I believe, of Palestinians resident in the territory that became the State of Israel were either expelled or fled, and ultimately were ethnically cleansed, because ethnic cleansing consists of two components. It's not just forcing people into refuge or expelling them. It's just as importantly preventing their return. And here, and Benny Morris has written, I think, an article about Yosef Weitz and the transfer committees. There was a very detailed initiative to prevent their return, and it consisted of raising hundreds of Palestinian villages to the ground, which was systematically implemented, and so on. And so Palestinians became a stateless people. Now, what is the most important reason that no Arab state was established in Palestine? Well, since the 1930s, the Zionist leadership and the Hashemite leadership of Jordan, as has been thoroughly researched and written about by the Israeli-British historian Avi Shlaim, essentially colluded to prevent the establishment of an independent Arab state in Palestine in the late 1940s. There's much more here, but I think those are the key points I would make about 1948.
We may talk about Zionism, Britain, UN assemblies, and all the things you mentioned. There's a lot to dig into. So again, if we can keep it to just one statement moving forward, sure. After Stephen, if you want to go longer. Also, we should acknowledge the fact that the speaking speeds of people here are different. Stephen speaks about 10 times faster than me. Stephen, do you want to comment on 1948?
Yeah, I think it's interesting where people choose to start the history.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so it's interesting what he says, because he speaks about the percentages. He says 55% to the Jewish state, 41 to 40% to 45% to a Palestinian state. This is true when it comes to partition, but he says that is de facto unjust. So I got 2 points on this. The first one is that wasn't the first plan of partition. There were many, many plans of partition that came before that. The Peel Commission is one which we spoke about earlier. There was something put forward which gave 17% of the land to the Jews for a Jewish state, and the Zionists said yes, and the Arabs of Palestine said no. So this wasn't a fact of percentages. It was a fact of he says the Zionist movement is unique in its supremacy and exclusivity. I think that's a reversal of the reality of what the Arab Palestinian national movement was at that particular time. And that's played out in practice. In practice, in the state of Israel today, you have nearly 2 million Arabs, 20% of the population, with full equal democratic rights. Is there one Jew in the sovereign Palestinian territories that exist, whether it was Gaza, which had been independent since 2005, there's no Jews there. Whether it's Ramallah or certain areas as a result of Oslo called, let's say, Area B and parts of Area A and parts of Area B in the West Bank. Are there any Jews living as Palestinian citizens there? There aren't. So, if he wants to speak about exclusivity and the inevitability of that exclusivity, he'll have to take that point into account. The other thing, they spoke about Weizmann, Chaim Weizmann. Now, Weizmann also had another quote, which would be inconvenient to both Rabbani and Norman Finkelstein. And it relates to this particularly because the percentage of the population of the land was amassed as a result of the Holocaust and the incoming refugee issue. But Weizmann himself actually said, given what has happened, the Jews will accept a state the size, and I quote, of a tablecloth. Okay, so it shows you where the Zionists were willing to go. They were internally compromising. Zionism was actually a very pragmatic movement, despite the description that's being portrayed over here by the two people presenting the Palestinian narrative. That's the one thing. The other thing is they're focusing on this from the perspective of the Holocaust, but the Zionist movement, as we know, comes around in the 1800s. The idea of a Jewish state is not the result of a Holocaust. Jews were already immigrating to I'm speaking from the Zionist movement. The first Aliyah was 1882. So we're talking more than a half a century before Hitler comes to power and kills 6 million Jews. So that element of Zionism in the Jewish national project is conveniently left out, because you can paint the specific narrative in which they're painting of how the Europeans' injustice to the Jews has led to the injustice against the Palestinians. By ignoring that the state of the Jews was not a result of the Holocaust. Yes, it played in the political favor of the Jewish nation state in the sense of creating the state in the aftermath of the war, but it was also created at the same time, as I said, as 100 other new countries around about that figure were being born. He mentions it now, countries in Africa, Rabbani mentions it, hadn't gained independence yet, but many of them were soon to gain independence after 1947. Anyway, point being, what I want to say is that, there's many holes that one can pick in all these things. The truth is that there were displacements and there were, transfers of some element, and a lot of the displacements were as a result of the Arabs of Palestine launching that civil war, the first stage of the war, as Benny Morris calls it. But it's, again, this is not unique. You can't really point to a war to me in which there hasn't been some sort of displacement of people. That doesn't make it morally correct. It doesn't make it right, but it is just a reality of war. So I don't see where they're drawing narratives by cherry picking quotes, but in practice, the Zionists said yes, and the Arabs of Palestine said no and launched the civil war. So, if we're going to look at responsibility for statelessness and dispossession and displacement, well, it's in action, not in the statements. I mean, I can turn around and cherry pick some Arab Palestinian statements, and I can link them to Nazism. In fact, you can link Hashim al-Husseini, the leader of the Palestinian National Project, who actually worked for the SS at the time, recruiting Balkan Balkan Muslims to fight on behalf of the Bosnian Muslims to fight on behalf of the Nazi regime, and once the war was lost, or he actually, from I think 41 to 44 or something like that, he actually worked in the SS office and received a monthly salary. So, there's ways to cherry pick that, but I'm not going to use that to say that the entire Palestinian people are inherently Nazis, right? So these people are kind of manipulating a lot of factors, cherry picking certain scenarios to kind of paint a picture. On Chaim Weizmann, for example, but Weizmann was also the one who said that they'll accept a tablecloth because of the Holocaust if need be.
I did not know this. I didn't know this about Husseini. That's interesting.
Yeah, Husseini's a notorious anti-Semite. Nazism really did make an influx into the Islamic world, and the Palestinian National Project was absolutely no exception to that. Husseini was the leader of the Palestinian National Project, and he was firstly actually collaborated with the Nazis, as I said, in Bosnia. And he worked for the Nazis in the SS office and received a salary for multiple years from the Nazi regime. And him and Hitler met in Germany. There's images and photos of it. People, so a simple Google search. There's even recently, I think last year, the German government released the documentation of the conversation of what was actually said. And he speaks about how the Arabs of Palestine can be the greatest allies to the Nazis against their war on the Jews, and so there's enough historical evidence there. I also think the notion of saying that anti-Semitism was somehow this kind of underlying factor of what Rabbani is trying to say is that the anti-Semitism experience that the Jews was somehow uniquely European. Well, yes, in all its horror, it was certainly European when it came to the Holocaust, but to assume that there was no anti-Semitism in the Middle East against the Jews would be a total erasure of history. The Islamic world does not itself, when it comes to anti-Semitism, hold the highest moral authority either.
Very true. Yeah, no, that's something we can go into as well, because there's always this notion that they try to paint, the Muslim world always tries to paint themselves as always having been tolerant to the Jewish people when they lived in those lands, and that's extremely far from the truth. All you can do is Google.
Objectively, they were not, in their mind's eye. If you lived as a dhimmi, which was basically the equivalent of a second-class citizen, and you paid jizya, the tax that second-class citizens, Jews, had to pay, well, they were tolerant of them. They tolerated them as dhimmis. They tolerated them as having to pay a tax. They tolerated them as living under second-class citizens. So the question is, what does tolerant mean? Tolerant to me and you, by the fact of this conversation, means that we live as equals, that we or possess the divine rights to human rights and all these kind of stuff. But in these to Islamic regimes, tolerate is not necessarily I grant you full equal rights. They tolerated them in the sense that they didn't send them to the gas chambers, but they were certainly not tolerant of them.
Definitely. Right. There's also men had to sit on the horse instead of sitting on the horse directly. They would have to sit to the side, how a Muslim woman would sit, and exactly. They also could not build, whether it was a church or a synagogue. They had to be shorter than any mosque. There were other rules. Yeah. So let's keep watching this.
I notice a lot of people like to start at either 47 or 48 because it's the first time where they can clearly point to a catastrophe that occurs on the Arab side that they want to ascribe 100% of the blame to the newly emergent Israeli state to. But I feel like when you have this type of reading of history, it feels like the goal is to moralize everything first and then to pick and choose facts that kind of support the statements of your initial moral statement afterwards. Whenever people are talking about 48 or the establishment of the Arab state, I never hear about the fact that a civil war started in 47. That was largely instigated because of the Arab rejectionism of the 47 partition plan. I never hear about the fact that the majority of the land that was acquired happened by purchases from Jewish organizations of Palestinian Arabs of the Ottoman Empire before the mandatory period in 1920 even started. Funnily enough, King Abdullah of Jordan was quoted as saying the Arabs are as prodigal in selling their land as they are in weeping about it. I never hear about the multiple times that Arabs rejected partition, rejected living with Jews, rejected any sort of state that would have even had any sort of Jewish exclusivity. It's funny because it was brought up before that the partition plan was unfair, and that's why the Arabs rejected it, as though they rejected it because it was unfair, because of the amount of land that Jews were given, and not just due to the fact that Jews were given land at all, as though a 30% partition or a 25% partition would have been accepted, when I don't think that was the reality of the circumstances. I feel like most of the other stuff has been said, but I noticed that whenever people talk about 48 or the years preceding 48, I think the worst thing that happens is there's a cherry picking of the facts where basically all of the blame is ascribed to this built-in idea of Zionism, that because of a handful of quotes or because of an ideology, we can say that transfer or population expulsion or basically the mandate of all of these Arabs being kicked off the land was always going to happen, when I think there's a refusal sometimes as well to acknowledge that regardless of the ideas of some of the Zionist leaders, there is a political, social, and military reality on the ground that they're forced to contend with. And unfortunately, the Arabs, because of their inability to engage in diplomacy and only to use tools of war to try to negotiate everything going on in mandatory Palestine, basically always gave the Jews a reason or an excuse to fight and acquire land through that way, because of their refusal to negotiate on anything else, whether it was the partition plan in 47, whether it was the Lausanne peace conference afterwards, where Israel even offered to annex Gaza in 51, where they offered to take in 100,000 refugees. Every single deal is just rejected out of hand because the Arabs don't want a Jewish state anywhere in this region of the world.
I would like to engage Professor Morris. If you don't mind, I'm not with the first name. It's just not my way of relating.
You can just call me Morris. You don't need the professor.
Okay. There's a real problem here. And it's been a problem I've had over many years of reading your work. Apart perhaps from as grandchild, I suspect nobody knows your work better than I do. I've read it many times, not once, not twice, at least 3 times, everything you've written. And the problem is, it's a kind of quicksilver. It's very hard to grasp a point and hold you to it. So we're going to try here to see whether we can hold you to a point. And then you argue with me the point. I have no problem with that. Your name, please?
Stephen Bonnell.
Okay. Mr. Bonnell referred to cherry picking and handful of quotes. Now,
this is the first time. This is the only time I think he's going to get his last name right. Let's see.
Yes,
it's true that when you wrote your first book on the Palestinian refugee question, you only had a few lines on this issue of transfer.
4 pages.
Yeah, in the first book.
4 pages.
Maybe 4. I'm not going to quarrel. My memory is not clear. We're talking about 40 years ago. I read it, but then I read other things about you. Okay. And you were taken to task, if my memory is correct, that you hadn't adequately documented the claims of transfer. Allow me to finish. And I thought that was a reasonable challenge because it was an unusual claim for a mainstream Israeli historian to say, as you did in that first book, that from the very beginning, transfer figured prominently in Zionist thinking. That was an unusual. If you read Anita Shapira, you read Shabtai Tevet, that was an unusual acknowledgement by you. And then I found it very impressive that in that revised version of your first book, you devoted 25 pages to copiously documenting the salience of transfer in Zionist thinking. And in fact, you used a very provocative and resonant phrase. You said that transfer was inevitable and inbuilt into Zionism. We're not talking about circumstantial factors, a war, Arab hostility. You said it's inevitable and inbuilt into Zionism. Now, as I said, so we won't be accused of cherry picking, those were 25 very densely argued pages. And then in an interview, and I could cite several quotes, but I'll choose one, you said, removing a population was needed. Let's look at the words. Without a population expulsion, a Jewish state would not have been established. Now, you're the one, again, I was very surprised when I read your book. Here I'm referring to Righteous Victims. I was very surprised when I came to that page 37, where you wrote that territorial displacement and dispossession was the chief motor of Arab resistance to Zionism. Territorial displacement and dispossession were the chief motor of Arab resistance to Zionism. So you then went on to say, because the Arab population rationally feared territorial displacement and dispossession, it of course opposed Zionism. That's as normal as Native Americans opposing the Euro-American manifest destiny in the history of our own country, because they understood it would be at their expense. It was inbuilt and inevitable. And so now, for you to come along and say that it all happened just because of the war, that otherwise the Zionists made all these plans for a happy minority to live there, that simply does not gel. It does not cohere. It is not reconcilable with what you yourself have written. It was inevitable and inbuilt. Now, in other situations you've said, that's true, but I think it was a greater good to establish a Jewish state at the expense of the indigenous population. That's another kind of argument. That was Theodore Roosevelt's argument in our own country. He said, we don't want the whole of North America to remain a squalid refuge for these wigwams and teepees. Yeah.
See, my major issue with this comparison is the Palestinians could have been there for an extremely long time. Even calling them Palestinians is an interesting thing to say. The very clear, distinct difference between using the Native Americans and as an example is Jewish people have a proven history of being there, versus the people who conquered the Americas did not have any history of being there. More so, being that the Palestinians, or you can call them the Arabs living in that land, the fact of the matter is Arabs are from Arabia. So that's
Yeah, well,
another
the
conversation we had.
Arabs of Palestine, I think for that time, particular point in history, I think it would be correct to use the phrase the Arabs of Palestine. Because Palestine was a region. So there were the Jews of Palestine, the Arabs of Palestine. Look, I mean, innately, what you're having here is you're having Norman, who's a historian, right? But he's engaging in kind of provocative statements and all these kind of comparisons, which is fine. He's drawing his analysis. The thing about Finkelstein and where he will always miss the point is that he neither speaks Hebrew nor Arabic. So Finkelstein does not actually have direct source information because he's not the one who's able to go to the direct source.
Right.
So Finkelstein has holes in his historical arguments. Benny Morris, for example, will sit when the historical vaults are open, they're in Hebrew. When any historical document comes out that's from the Arab world, it's in Arabic. And then you've got a whole bunch of people who translate things and mistranslate things and write their own interpretation of the events on what happened. So if you believe in the Palestinian narrative, then yes, your position against rejecting Zionism was legitimate because you viewed Zionism as a colonial movement. Except for the fact that not only is that historically inaccurate, not only were there continuous Jewish presence on the land, but I think if you spoke to the average Palestinian on the ground in 1920, no one was turning around and saying Zionism is a European colonial movement, right? That's not it's not the way the rejections were coming in. The bottom line is that I've always said, and I'm always open to be proven wrong on this factor, but I always viewed kind of Arab expansionism across the region as a secularized version of the Islamic conquests, meaning that the Arabs of Palestine, like their brethren throughout the region, inherently viewed the entire region, the Middle East, as Arab land to liberate from the French and British and at some stage Ottoman colonial empires. And when a Jewish state comes along, well, the Jewish state is in some sense is a sin existing in that part of the world. So I mean, these are all retroactive narratives that people have come up with, but you can't really find anything in the actual historical documentation to suggest that the Arabs of Palestine saw Zionism as a European movement that was inherently there to displace them and transfer them. This all comes afterwards.
Right. Yeah. No, that's very astute. I think the funny thing also is being that they're primarily religious people in this region. I don't know when I say that, I'm talking about the Arab population. They believe in not allowing us to have a country because we're mentioned in the Quran in the first place, right? So we're going back to this example of Indians and Christopher Columbus and people who came and the British who came and took the land that was never theirs to begin with, has no religious significance, no significance of any kind. That's why that analogy makes no sense whatsoever. The Muslims, on the other hand, say, hey, we took this from the Jews who no longer have a right to it anymore. That kind of argues the point in and of itself. That alone makes Norman's argument completely obsolete.
Well, that's No, that's true. You see, the thing is that would be true if you believed that history existed before 1800. But unfortunately, the history in which we look at that has now shaped our world is pretty much from, if you look at historical discourse that's happening now among the masses, obviously not historians focused on particular areas and topics, but among the masses, most people, when they speak about history, basically start their history in the 1700s with America, 1800s, and and forget the fact that, you know, there was millennia long history, recorded history before that. The Finkelstein's whole analysis here about Native Americans, colonial this and all of that, it plays into the entire misreading of this conflict beyond just the obvious statement of a colonial enterprise. But what it does is it puts this very Western lens onto this issue, and I think it plays into what you're speaking about. People very rarely fight wars over territory, over food, over resources. People predominantly fight wars over the ideas in their head. And when people think that you can solve a national conflict because everyone seeks the same need, let that be security, freedom, dignity, and liberty, and the right to acquire property, they're wrong. People mainly fight wars over the ideas in their head, the meaning and significance of religion, of tradition, the desire to find belonging in the national myth or transcendence through some sort of higher divine power, whether it exists or not. And that is really why people fight wars. That's what makes it so difficult to solve conflicts like Israel-Palestine, because people are fighting over an idea in their head. And the idea at the bottom line of this conflict is, at its very core, which has remained consistent, is that the Jews want a state in the land of Israel, or the historic Palestine, however people want to refer to that specific region of the world. And the Palestinians want the Jews to not have a state in that part of the world. So that is really still the cornerstone. People can speak narratives around each other, but bottom line, the Jews said yes, and said yes many times. And the Arabs of Palestine said no, and said no every time. And that is always going to be the one difference that, as things currently exist, cannot be split.
I think the fact of the matter is, in a weird way, if you really dissect this, by us agreeing to do that, we are admitting that maybe it isn't ours in the first place. And do you get where I'm going with that? And so the Arabs are saying, if it was really yours, you wouldn't be willing to split it. Since we believe it's ours, we're not willing to split it with you. So I think, as much as it sounds nice to the international community that we're willing to split it, that ultimately tells not only the Arab world, but the world as a whole, that maybe we don't truly believe it was ours in the first place. Do you get what I'm saying? And so
I understand that. It's important what you say, because it is. I actually have spoken to Arab researchers before from other parts of the region here in the Middle East who have said things along those lines about that is the message that they received, and it enforces that stereotype. But ultimately, when you look at, even they themselves, who view themselves as kin to this region, also accepted nation states and borders at that same period in time. So it's just because at the end of the day, Zionism, thank God for me sitting here in Israel, you who's lived here before as well, was pragmatic enough to live in the global reality, where the Arabs of Palestine were not pragmatic and didn't live in the global reality at the time, and therefore have struggled to be a part of the global reality today.
That's a very good point. It's a very good point. Okay, let's continue this.
You have to get rid of him and make this a great country. But he didn't deny that it was inbuilt and inevitable.
I think you've made your point. First, I'll take up something that Muin said. He said that the Nakba was inevitable.
As have you.
And predictable. No, I've never said that. It was inevitable and predictable only because the Arabs assaulted the Jewish community and state in 1947-48. Had there been no assault, there probably wouldn't have been a refugee problem. There's no reason for a refugee problem to have occurred, expulsions to have occurred, a dispossession, massive dispossession to occur. These occurred as a result of war. Now, Norman said that I said that transfer was inbuilt into Zionism in one way or another. And this is certainly true. In order to buy land, the Jews bought tracts of land on which some Arabs sometimes lived. Sometimes they bought tracts of land on which which there weren't Arab villages, but sometimes they bought land on which there were Arabs. And according to Ottoman law and the British, at least in the initial years of the British mandate, the law said that the people who bought the land could do what they liked with the people who didn't own the land, who were basically squatting on the land, which is the Arab tenant farmers, which is, we're talking about a very small number actually of Arabs who were displaced as a result of land purchases in the Ottoman period or the mandate period. But there was dispossession in one way. They didn't possess the land, they didn't own it, but they were removed from the land. And this did happen in Zionism. And there's, if you like, an inevitability in Zionist ideology of buying tracts of land and starting to work it yourself and settle it with your own people and so on. That made sense. But what we're really talking about is what happened in 47-48. And in 47-48, the Arabs started a war. And actually, people pay for their mistakes. And the Palestinians have never actually agreed to pay for their mistakes. They make mistakes, they attack, they suffer as a result. And we see something similar going on today in the Gaza Strip. They do something terrible. They kill 1,200 Jews. They abduct 250 women and children and babies and old people and whatever. And then they start screaming, please save us from what we did, because the Jews are counterattacking. And this is what happened then. And this is what's happening now. There's something fairly similar in the situation here. Expulsion, and this is important, Norman, you should pay attention to this. You didn't raise that. Expulsion, transfer were never policy of the Zionist movement before 47. It doesn't exist in Zionist platforms of the various political parties, of the Zionist organization, of the Israeli state, of the Jewish agency. Nobody would have actually made it into policy because there was always a large minority, if there were people who wanted it, always a large minority of Jewish politicians and leaders would have said, no, this is immoral. We cannot start a state on the basis of an expulsion. So it was never adopted, and actually was never adopted as policy even in 48, even though Ben-Gurion wanted as few Arabs in the course of the war staying in the Jewish state after they attacked it. He didn't want disloyal citizens staying there because they wouldn't have been loyal citizens. But this made sense in the war itself. But the movement itself and its political parties never accepted it. It's true that in 1937, when the British, as part of the proposal by the Peel Commission to divide the country into two states, one Arab, one Jewish, which the Arabs, of course, rejected, Peel also recommended that the Arabs, most of the Arabs in the Jewish state should be transferred, because otherwise, if they stayed and were disloyal to the emergent Jewish state, this would cause endless disturbances, warfare, killing, and so on. So Ben-Gurion and Weizmann latched onto this proposal by the most famous democracy in the world, the British democracy, when they proposed the idea of transfer side by side with the idea of partition, because it made sense. And they said, well, if the British say so, we should also advocate it, but they never actually tried to pass it as Zionist policy, and they fairly quickly stopped even talking about transfer after 1938.
So just to clarify, what you're saying is that 47 was an offensive war, not a defensive war.
By the Arabs, yes.
By the Arabs.
Yeah.
And you're also saying that there was never a top-down policy of expulsion.
Yes.
Just to clarify the point.
If I understood you correctly.
Well, real quick, just wanted to say this. This is like Ben Morris was saying. What happened in the 48 war is what's happening now in Gaza in terms of the Arabs waging a war. And then when the outcome isn't to their liking and they lose, they start complaining. It's okay if you want to start a war with the goal of eradicating the state, of for sure definitely dismantling the state. If that at the very least, if your goal isn't to completely kill as many Jews as possible, which is very apparent in every major war that they waged against Israel, in addition to what happened on October 7th, if Hamas could have gotten their way, they would have killed every single Jew there. If they would have spared some Jews, they definitely would have taken the land completely. And so when they weren't successful, which I think they knew they probably weren't going to succeed at that endeavor, what did you think was going to happen? So after the Gazans were celebrating in the streets, beating the hostages as they came in, celebrating, excited, hoping that maybe this was the day they would liberate, quote unquote, Palestine. And then, of course, Israel comes in and retaliates. Now they're crying about it. Well, what did you think was going to happen?
Well, I think both of you bring up a very important point. I'll tell you something. I call this the 4-step process, what you guys are speaking about. There's 4 stages in the Palestinian operation when it comes to war. It's prevalent in 47 and 48. It's prevalent in 67. It's prevalent in 2000 with the Second Intifada, and it's prevalent again on October 7th in 2023. It always begins with an initiation of active aggression, accompanied by the second stage, which is celebratory triumphalism, to celebrate the attack as if they've already won the war, followed by a military defeat. And then the 4th stage is, upon that military defeat, there's a process of where there is no self-reflection for their part in stages 1, 2, and 3, but an immediate kind of transference to righteous victimhood. So if you look at 47, 48, they're speaking about it now, so I won't go into the details of that, but there is in 47 the civil war that starts to prevent the establishment of the Jewish state. Upon that fading, the Arab armies invade to wipe out the Jewish state. They lose the war. The narrative becomes one solely of displacement and dispossession. rather than acknowledging their place and starting a civil war and rejecting the partition plan. You see it in 67 again. For months leading up to the 1967 war, there was Arab and Palestinian proclamations that they were going to overturn the result of 1948 and wipe Israel off the map. Before the war had even begun, with Egypt moving its 150 or 100,000 troops up there into the peninsula. There was celebrations throughout the streets of Cairo, as well as in the West Bank, and especially Gaza as well, with Palestinians at that point in time being occupied by Gaza, by Egypt. Nonetheless, that's the second stage of celebratory triumphalism. But upon that military defeat, it becomes a narrative of solely occupation. And then you could fast forward to 2000. Comes at a time just after Arafat walks away from the peace deal to accept two states, much like the Palestinian national leaders walked away from partition 50 years earlier than that. And they waged the second intifada. And they waged this intifada in the name of resistance to the occupation. But this is the very same occupation that could have come to an end just weeks before had they accepted the peace deal, which would have brought an end to the occupation. You see it again in 2023. We don't have to go through that now because it's unfolding before our eyes. But these are essentially the four stages. And if there's no self-reflection after a war, no ability to see one's culpability and responsibility in that, and there's the narrative shifts not from wiping Israel off the map or preventing the establishment of the state of Israel to solely dispossession, to wiping Israel off the map, to solely occupation, which is the narrative post the war. From the rejection of the peace accord to resistance against the occupation that the peace accord actually would have ended, but they called the rejection a sense of victory. This is where we are today as well. We're seeing it unfold before our eyes. So any ability on the part of the Palestinians to repeat the mistake of previous generations essentially sets the stage for repetition of another war, and that's what I'm most concerned about going forward.
That's great. Wow. But we're also incentivizing it. We're essentially telling them, hey, if you continue to fight this war of attrition or wars of attrition, you may get more land. We may get tired of the fighting. And at some point, you might have just enough land to be able to wage a war you can actually win. I think that's the consensus that they have. Otherwise, they wouldn't be doing it as long as they have been. It almost seems like we're incentivizing them to continue to do it.
Look, I think that the question comes in here in that if this is a conflict of exhaustion, essentially between Zionism and anti-Zionism, it's about which idea crumbles first under the nature of exhaustion. Do the Palestinians turn around and say, all right, well, we accept the idea of a Jewish state in some part of the land, or do the Jews turn around and say, for the last 100 years or so, this has actually not been worth it. We're done. Those are basically your two options there. We have to simultaneously recognize two things at once, which can be difficult, and people wonder how to even comprehend that. You've got an enemy population on the other side of your border, which basically, I believe that the Palestinians as a people have the right to self-determination. I also believe it's in the best interest of Israel for the Palestinians to have their own state. But most people look at that and they say, well, they don't, it's a very difficult thing because the Palestinians, for the most part, by the fact of what their cause is, do not extend that same right to me. Okay, but
go ahead.
Yeah, they don't extend that same right to me. But the point in principle here is not that because they don't extend that right to me, I will then act in a specific way or do something specific to them. Egypt and Israel at one stage were bitter enemies, and Egypt didn't make peace or sign a non-aggression pact, whatever you want to call it, with Israel because Israel decided to become anti-Zionist or decided to lose itself. It signed it because Israel was strong, but Israel wasn't stupid in the process of being strong. Israel didn't go and, push people out and do a whole bunch of stuff, for example, which, some people get to this point, well, it's a conflict of exhaustion and we're incentivizing them to think, but with territory and everything. I think that lands up, the blowback of that lands up being self-destructive. So it's a very complicated picture to solve a war that at its core is actually so simple because it's based off one idea.
Okay, well, just I guess when you say the idea, are you talking about the fact that they're not willing to accept our end?
Well, there's two ideas that really rest at this whole thing. The Jews want a state, the Palestinians want the Jews to not have a state, right?
Right.
But ideas change. Ideas are movable under the right circumstances and under the right leadership and under the right a self-reflection of a collective consciousness shift. We've seen it with Japan, we've seen it with Argentina, we've seen it with Rwanda, we've seen it in many cases throughout the last century. It's not that it's impossible, it's just what does it take? My concern is essentially being stuck in a war of exhaustion, and we just see tragedy until that point. What basically needs to happen is conditions and consequences. So what you're saying is that this is where there's incentivization for the Palestinians to continue this war, and that's precisely because there's no conditions and consequences. So what I mean is that, they're speaking about 47, they're mentioning World War II here as well. The Palestinians prior to October 7th received 4 times the amount of aid than the whole of Europe did in the Marshall Plan for post-World War II recovery. And that's inflation accounted for. So, there's no conditions on that. So, of course, if you have a political goal and you are being funded and financed and you continue that political goal and there's no conditions or consequences on anything, well, then it appears that you're being greenlit to continue. There needs to be conditions and consequences before anything. You do not receive this amount of money unless you do X, Y, and Z. You do not receive this unless you do X, Y, and Z. You do not receive X, Y, Z, whatever it is. Whatever it is, for everything that is being given, because a lot will be given after this war, everything has to be conditioned with consequences. If that's not the thing, then the war of exhaustion goes on. But the war of exhaustion can be broken with consequence and conditioning.
I hear it. Okay, let's keep watching because I know this conversation will be able to continue this.
You're making the claim that transfer, expulsion, and so on was in fact a very localized phenomenon, resulting from individual land purchases, and that, if I understand you correctly, you're also making the claim that the idea that a Jewish state requires a removal or overwhelming reduction of the non-Jewish population was...
If the Arabs are attacking you, yes.
But that, let's say prior to 1947, it would be your claim that the idea that a significant reduction or wholesale removal of their population was not part of Zionist thinking. Well, I think there's 2 problems with that. I think what you're saying about localized disputes is correct, but I also think that there is a whole literature that demonstrates that transfer was envisioned by Zionist leaders on a much broader scale than simply individual land purchases. In other words, it went way beyond, we need to remove these tenants so that we can farm this land. The idea was we can't have a state where all these Arabs remain and we have to get rid of them. And the second, I think, impediment to that view is that long before the UN General Assembly convened to address the question of Palestine, Palestinian and Arab and other leaders as well had been warning ad infinitum that the purpose of the Zionist movement is not just to establish a Jewish state, but to establish an exclusivist Jewish state, and that transfer, forced displacement, was fundamental to that project. And just responding to, sorry, was it Bunnell or Donnell?
Yeah.
With a B?
Yeah.
You made the point that the problem here is that people don't recognize is that the first and last result for the Arabs is always war. I think there's a problem with that. I think you might do well to recall the 1936 general strike conducted by Palestinians at the beginning of the revolt, which at the time was the longest recorded general strike in history. You may want to consult the book published last year by Laurie Allen, A History of False Hope, which discusses in great detail the consistent engagement by Palestinians, their leaders, their elites, their diplomats, and so on, with all these international committees. If we look at today, the Palestinians are once again going to the International Court of Justice. They're consistently trying to persuade the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court to do his job. They have launched widespread boycott campaigns. So, of course, the Palestinians have engaged in military resistance. But I think the suggestion that this has always been their first and last resort and that they have somehow spurned civic action, spurned diplomacy, I think really has no basis in reality.
I'll respond to that in a question for Norm to take into account, I think, when he answers, but I am curious. Obviously, I have fresher eyes on this, and I'm a newcomer to this arena versus the three of you guys for sure. A claim that gets brought up a lot has to do with the inevitability of transfer in Zionism, or the idea that as soon as the Jews envisioned a state in Palestine, they knew that it would involve some mass transfer of population, perhaps a mass expulsion. I'm sure we'll talk about Plan Dalet or Plan D at some point. The issue that I run into is, while you can find quotes from leaders, while you can find maybe desires expressed in diaries, I feel like it's hard to truly ever know if there would have been mass transfer in the face of Arab peace, because I feel like every time there was a huge deal on the table that would have had a sizable Jewish and Arab population living together, the Arabs would reject it out of hand. So, for instance, when we say that transfer was inevitable, when we say that Zionists would have never accepted, a sizable Arab population, how do you explain the acceptance of the 47 partition plan that would have had a huge Arab population living in the Jewish state? Is your contention that after the acceptance of that, after the establishment of that state, that Jews would have slowly started to expel all of these Arab citizens from their country? Or how do you explain that in Lausanne a couple years later that Israel was willing to formally annex the Gaza Strip and make 200,000 or so people those citizens? But I'm just curious, how do we get this idea of Zionism always means mass transfer, when there were times, at least early on in the history of Israel and a little bit before it, where Israel would have accepted a state that would have had a massive Arab population in it? Is your idea that they would have just slowly expelled them afterwards? Or
is that question to me or Norm?
Or to either one? I'm just curious for the incorporation of the answer. Yeah.
There's some misunderstandings here, so let's try to clarify that. Number one, it was the old historians who would point to the fact, in Professor Morris's terminology, the old historians, what he called not real historians, he called them chroniclers, not real historians. It was the old Israeli historians who denied the centrality of transfer in Zionist thinking. It was then Professor Morris who, contrary to Israel's historian establishment, who said, now you remind me it's 4 pages, but it came at the end of the book. It was
No, it's at the beginning of the book.
Transfer.
Yeah, transfer is dealt with in 4 pages at the beginning of my first book on the Palestinian refugee problem.
It's a fault of my memory, but the point still stands. It was Professor Morris who introduced this idea in what you might call a big way.
Yeah, but I didn't say it's central to the Zionist experiment. You're saying centrality. I never said it was central. I said it was there. The idea.
By the way, it's okay to respond back and forth. This is great. And also, just a quick question, if I may. You're using quotes from Benny, from Professor Morris. It's also okay to say those quotes do not reflect the full context of the. So, like, if we go back, to quotes we've said in the past, and you've both here have written, the three of you have written on this topic a lot, is we should be careful and just admit, like, well, yeah, well, that's
just real quick, just to be clear, the contention is that Norm is quoting apart and saying that this was the entire reason for this, whereas Benny's saying it's apart.
I'm not quoting apart. I'm quoting 25 pages where Professor Morris was at great pains to document the claim that appeared in those early 4 pages of his book. Now, you say it never became part of the official Zionist platform.
It never became part of policy.
Fine. We're also asked, well, this is true. Why did that happen? Why did that happen? It's because it's a very simple fact, which everybody understands. Ideology doesn't operate in a vacuum. There are real world practical problems. You can't just take an ideology and superimpose it on a political reality and turn it into a fact. It was the British mandate. There was significant Arab resistance to Zionism. And that resistance was based on the fact, as you said, the fear of territorial displacement and dispossession. So you couldn't very well expect the Zionist movement to come out in neon lights and announce, hey, we're going to be expelling you the first chance we get. That's not realistic.
Let me respond. Look, you said it a number of times that the Arabs, from fairly early on in the conflict from the 1890s or the early 1900s, said the Jews intend to expel us. This doesn't mean that it's true. It means that some Arabs said this, maybe believing it was true, maybe using it as a political instrument to gain support to mobilize Arabs against the Zionist experiment. But the fact is, transfer did not occur before 1947. And Arabs later said, and since then, have said that the Jews want to build a third temple on the Temple Mount, as if that's what really the
Sorry, I try to get your attention there, but I just want to go back to something that he said, Rabbani, because he points to a protest held in 1936 to say that the Arabs tried other initiatives other than military than military attacks. Except what he's conveniently leaving out is that those protests were called the Great Revolt from 1936 to 1939. And one of the sole purposes of them was actually to prevent Jewish immigration from Europe. And many of those Jews perished in the Holocaust. So this was not some innocent idea against the British mandate. This was the British mandate essentially had an open-ended policy to Jewish immigration to Palestine as a result of an agreement with the Zionist movement. And the Arabs of Palestine held 3 years worth of protests and to get them to shut the borders to Jewish immigration from Jews who were escaping the rise of Hitler. So, again, these points kind of start falling flat the minute you look just a little bit below the surface. You can say, oh, well, they don't just fight wars, they also protested. Okay, well, what were they protesting? They were protesting Jewish immigration. So I think that's just important to note. And anyway, we'll carry on because I know it's now gone on to, another section. I don't want to go back.
Got it.
Mainstream of Zionism has always wanted and always strived for. But this is nonsense. It's something that Husseini used to use as a way to mobilize masses for the cause, using religion as the way to get them to join him. The fact that Arabs said that the Zionists wanted to dispossess us doesn't mean it's true. It just means that there's some Arabs thought that, maybe said it sincerely and maybe insincerely.
Professor Morris.
Later it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. This is true.
Professor
Morris, the Arabs attacked the Jews.
Professor Morris, I read through your stuff. Even yesterday, I was looking through Righteous Victim.
You should read other things. You're wasting your time.
No, actually, no. I do read other things, but I don't consider it a waste of time to read you. Not at all. You say that this wasn't inherent in Zionism. Now, would you agree that David Ben-Gurion was a Zionist?
A major Zionist leader.
Right. Would you agree Chaim Weizmann was a Zionist?
Yeah.
Okay. I believe they were. I believe they took their ideology seriously. It was the first generation. Just like with the Bolsheviks, the first generation was committed to an idea. By the 1930s, it was just pure realpolitik. The ideology went out the window. The first generation, I have no doubt about their convictions. Okay? They were Zionists. Transfer was inevitable and inbuilt in Zionism.
You keep repeating the same thing.
Because I have, as I said then, Mr. Morris, I have a problem reconciling what you're saying. It either was incidental or it was deeply entrenched. Here I read, it's deeply entrenched. Two very resonant words, inevitable and inbuilt.
Deeply entrenched, I never wrote.
Well, I'm not sure.
It's something you just invented.
Okay.
But
Inevitable and inbuilt.
The idea,
Okay,
let me concede
fine.
something.
No.
The idea of transfer was there. Israel Zangwill, a British Zionist, talked about it early on in the century. Even Herzl, in some way, talked about transferring population.
According to your 25 pages, everybody talked.
Well, that's right. We keep bringing up this line, the 25 page and the 4 pages. We're lucky to have Benny in front of us right now. We don't need to go to the quotes. We can legitimately ask, how central is expulsion to Zionism in its early version of Zionism, in whatever Zionism is today, and how much power, influence does Zionism and ideology have in Israel, and influence the philosophy, the ideology of Zionism have on Israel today?
The Zionist movement up to 1948, Zionist ideology was central to the whole Zionist experience, the whole enterprise up to 1948. And I think Zionist ideology was also important in the first decades of Israel's existence. Slowly, the hold of Zionism, if you like Bolshevism held the Soviet Union, gradually faded. And a lot of Israelis today think in terms of individual success and then the capitalism and all sorts of things which have nothing to do with Zionism. But Zionism was very important. But what I'm saying is that the idea of transfer wasn't the core of Zionism. The idea of Zionism was to save the Jews who had been vastly persecuted in Eastern Europe and incidentally in the Arab world, the Muslim world, for centuries, and eventually ending up with the Holocaust. The idea of Zionism was to save the Jewish people by establishing a state or re-establishing a Jewish state on the ancient Jewish homeland, which is something the Arabs today even deny, that there were Jews in Palestine or the land of Israel 2,000 years ago. Arafat famously said, what temple was there on Temple Mount? Maybe it was in Nablus, which of course is nonsense. But
That's ironic because discussing how Al-Aqsa, right? Discussing Al-Aqsa, not even having significance there. I know you're familiar with Rabbi Mordechai Kadari talks about this when I had a debate with him. So if the people listening definitely would love for you to check out the debate I did with him. If you scroll to my videos or you search Soothing Semantics, Kedar, Kedar, you'll find it. And he talks about just in Islam how Palestinians purport the Al-Aqsa Mosque to be on top of the Temple Mount. So he goes into that. It's just very interesting. I just wanted to make a quick point.
They had a strong connection for thousands.
Yeah, a very interesting point about how now the argument that pro-Palestinians make all over the world now with all these rallies about how this is a white colonialist project, not taking into account that the majority, as you and I have mentioned, the majority of Israelis have never lived in Europe.
Yes.
Years to the land to which they wanted to return and returned there. They found that on the land lived hundreds of thousands of Arabs, and the question was how to accommodate the vision of a Jewish state in Palestine alongside the existence of these Arab masses living on, who were indigenous, in fact, to the land by that stage. And the idea of partition, because they couldn't live together, because the Arabs didn't want to live together with the Jews, and I think the Jews also didn't want to live together in one state with Arabs in general. The idea of partition was the thing which the Zionists accepted. Okay, we can only get a small part of Palestine. The Arabs will get in 1937 most of Palestine. In 1947, the ratios were changed, but we can live side by side with each other in a partitioned Palestine. And this was the essence of it. The idea of transfer was there, but it was never adopted as policy. But in 1947-48, the Arabs attacked, trying to destroy essentially the Zionist enterprise and the emergent Jewish state. And the reaction was transfer in some way, not as policy, but this is what happened on the battlefield. And this is also what Ben Gurion at some point began to want as well.
Right. Well, you know, one of the first books on this issue I read when I was still in high school, because my late father had it, was the Diaries of Theodor Herzl. And I think, you know, Theodor Herzl, of course, was the founder of the contemporary Zionist movement. And I think if you read that, it's very clear. For Herzl, the model upon which the Zionist movement would proceed, his model was Cecil Rhodes. I think, you know, Rhodes, from what I recall, correct me if I'm wrong, has quite a prominent place in Herzl's diaries. I think Herzl was also corresponding with him and seeking his support. Cecil Rhodes, of course, was the British colonialist after whom the former white minority regime in Rhodesia was named. And Herzl also says explicitly in his diaries that it is essential to remove the existing population from Palestine. In a moment, he says we shall have to spirit the penniless population across the borders and procure employment for them elsewhere. And Israel Zangwill, who you mentioned, a land without a people for a people without a land. They knew damn well it wasn't a land without a people. I'll continue, but please go ahead.
There is one small diary entry in Herzl's vast...
it's 5 volumes.
Yeah, 5 volumes. There's one paragraph which actually mentions the idea of transfer. There are people who think that Herzl was actually pointing to South America when he was talking about that. The Jews were going to move to Argentina, and then they would try and buy out or buy off or spirit the penniless natives to make way for Jewish settlement. Maybe he wasn't even talking about the Arabs in that particular passage. That's the argument of some people. Maybe he was. But the point is, it has only a 1/100th of 1% of the diary which is devoted to the subject. It's not a central idea in Herzl's thinking. What Herzl wanted, and this is what's important, not Rhodes, I don't think he was the model. Herzl wanted to create a liberal, democratic, Western state in Palestine for the Jews. That was the idea. Not some imperial enterprise serving some imperial master, which is what Rhodes was about, but to have a Jewish state which was modeled on the Western democracies in Palestine. And this, incidentally, was more or less what Weizmann and Ben Gurion wanted. Ben Gurion was more of a socialist, Weizmann was more of a liberal a Westerner, but they wanted to establish a social democratic or liberal state in Palestine. And they both envisioned through most of the years of their activity that there would be an Arab minority in that Jewish state. It's true that Ben Gurion strived to have as small as possible an Arab minority in the Jewish state, because he knew that if you want a Jewish majority state, that would be necessary. But it's not something which they were willing to translate into actual policy.
Just a quick pause to mention that for people who are not familiar, Theodor Herzl, we're talking about over a century ago, and everything we've been talking about has been mostly 1948 and before.
Yes. Just one clarification on Herzl's diaries. I mean, the other thing that I recall from those diaries is he was very preoccupied with, in fact, getting great power patronage, seeing
Yes.
Palestine, the Jewish state in Palestine, I think his words, an outpost of civilization against barbarism.
Yes.
In other words, very much seeing his project as a proxy for Western imperialism in the Middle East.
Right, not proxy. He wanted to establish a Jewish state which would be independent. To get that, he hoped that he would be able to garner support from major imperial powers.
Including the Ottoman Sultan, who he tried to cultivate. I just want to respond to a point you made earlier, which was that people expressed their rejection of the partition resolution on the grounds that it gave the majority of Palestine to the Jewish community, which formed only a third. Whereas, in fact, if I understood you correctly, you're saying the Palestinians and the Arabs would have rejected any partition resolution.
Yeah, I think the one that would have rejected any two. A lot of that land given was in the Negev. It was pretty terrible land at the time. And the land that would have been partitioned to Jews, I think would have been, I think I saw it was like 500,000 Arabs. It would have been 500,000 Jews, 400,000 Arabs, and I think like 80,000 Bedouin would have been there. So the state would have been.
I think you raise a valid point, because I think the Palestinians did reject the partition of their homeland in principle. And I think the fact that the United Nations General Assembly then awarded the majority of their homeland to the Zionist movement only added insult to injury. I mean, one doesn't have to sympathize with the Palestinians to recognize that they have now been a stateless people for 75 years. Can you name any country, yours, for example, or yours, that would be prepared to give 55%, 25%, 10% of your country to the Palestinians? Of course not. And so the issue was not the existence of Jews in Palestine. They had been there for centuries. And of course, they had ties to Palestine, and particularly to Jerusalem and other places, going back centuries, if not millennia. But the idea of establishing an exclusively Jewish state at the expense of those who were already living there, I think it was right to reject that. And I don't think we can look back now, 75 years later, and say, well, you should have accepted losing 55% of your homeland because you ended up losing 78% of it, and the remaining 22% was occupied in 1967. That's not how things work.
Yeah.
And I can...
Wait, you're muted.
Yeah, my mistake. You mentioned that in different, aside from the Peel Commission and the Partition Plan of 47, there was another one where the Israelis said would have had considerably less land And in addition, the Palestinian side would have no Jews in it. The Israeli side would have a significant Arab population. So they rejected it every single time. And Muin Rabani is saying it's not fair, but you still had the option, and over time gained less and less land. Then a war was waged and you lost. So the reality is they were never going to accept this to begin with. So he's saying, okay, it's unfair. But at the end of the day, if you didn't have your own state, if it was the British mandated land where you never had your own sovereign state in the first place, now you're being given an option that might not be unfair, but you're still now being given the option to have a state. Where in the earlier times where you had that option to share it, you rejected it and then continued to reject it as you received less and less, right? And then a war is waged. And if I'm incorrect in anything, please correct me. And if a war is a war that you waged, you now lost, in addition to having other Arab armies join you in the goal of eradicating the Jews, now you're complaining that it's not fair. I don't think it was very fair when you, not having a state, wage a war against a small population, the Jewish population, having nowhere else to go. You actually, if you lose, have somewhere else to go, which is proven. They went to Jordan, they went to Egypt, Lebanon, etc. You lose, and now you're complaining. This has been my major argument since I started doing my podcast.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think what always seems interesting to me is this incessant focus to try and make the Palestinian issue unique in the sense of statelessness. So he says, the Palestinians, what other people do you know that are stateless and remain stateless today? I also don't know in other people that have continuously rejected statehood.
There are plenty of groups. The Druze don't have a state. They're perfectly fine with it.
Druze aren't interested necessarily in state. It's part of their national identity. The Kurds don't have a state, but it's not really a question of whether statehood is just or not. Statehood is just, and statehood would in principle be just for the Palestinians. The point is that the Palestinians don't have a state because they keep saying no. I mean, right. That's what's unique about the Palestinians is any liberation movement is willing to make compromises because the concept, the feeling of not being free is awful. We know this because all liberation movements have made that decision. No liberation movement consistently denies the liberation and sovereignty of their own unless they believe that they can undo the sovereignty and liberation of another, their neighbor. And I think that is what makes the Palestinian predicament unique, not statelessness in and of itself. It's not that a state has never been on the table for the Palestinians. It was in multiple times in the 20th century, multiple times in the onset of the 21st century. What's unique is that the Palestinians have consistently said, no, that is what is unique.
Right. We want to, so just quoting them, if I were Palestinian now, we want a state, but we don't want you to have one because we believe that you having a state means that your state is on our state. We're not willing to share that with you. It is either ours and not yours, or we refuse to accept this altogether. And you need to either leave or you need to relinquish your leadership over what we believe is ours. And that's I think.
Well, as I said earlier, this is a conflict of exhaustion between Zionism and anti-Zionism. Those are the two sentiments that were just expressed. Who gives up on the idea first? The anti-Zionists or the Zionists?
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, it's a war. Yeah.
I can imagine an American rejecting giving 10% of the United States to the Palestinians. And if that rejection leads to war and you lose half your country, I doubt that 50 years from now you're going to say, well, maybe I should have accepted that.
Sure. So I like this answer more than what I usually feel like I'm hearing when it comes to the Palestinian rejection of the 47 partition plan. Because sometimes I feel like a weird switch happens to where the Arabs in the area are actually presented as entirely pragmatic people who are simply doing a calculation and saying like, well, we're losing 55% of our land. Jews are only maybe 1/3 of the people here, and we've got 45. And the math doesn't work basically. But it wasn't a math problem. I think, like you said,
it was a matter of principle.
It was an ideology problem.
No, it was a matter of principle.
Yeah, ideologically driven. That they, as a people, have a right to or are entitled to this land that they've never actually had an independent state on, that they've never had even a guarantee of an independent state on, that they've never actually ruled over.
That last point is actually not correct because for all its injustice, the mandate system recognized Palestine as a Class A mandate, which provisionally recognized the independence of that territory.
Of what would emerge from that territory, but not of the Palestinian.
It was provisionally recognized.
But not, but the territory itself was, but not of the Palestinian people to have a right or a guarantee to a government.
It was a British mandate of Palestine, not the British mandate of Israel.
The word exclusive, which you keep using, is nonsense. The state which Ben-Gurion envisioned would be a Jewish majority state, as they...
Yeah.
Isn't it interesting what he said there? Now all of a sudden the mandate is legitimate. What Rabbani says. Well, actually, that's not true. The mandate actually assigns the Palestinian people a state. But he's literally just spent the last, I don't know how, we're an hour in. He spent the last hour saying how illegitimate the idea of partition and the mandate was for various reasons. The minute Destiny brings up this point about Palestinian state, then all of a sudden the mandate is de facto legitimate, and it acknowledges the right of the Palestinians to a state. So as long as the mandate is working in his favor, it's legitimate. As long as it can be proven, as the Arabs are saying no, then it's an illegitimate document which was unjust. And that's really that really is the idea of the Palestinian narrative. This is the way in which it operates, that and using euphemisms like ethnic cleansing and genocide and apartheid. That's what you can do. You can see use it, don't use it, and throw in a whole bunch of language which can inflame the conversation and make it emotionally triggering. But that's the cornerstone of Palestinian dialogue.
That's so good.
They accepted the 1947 partition resolution, as Stephen said. That included 400,000 plus Arabs in a state which would have 500,000 Jews. So the idea of exclusivity wasn't anywhere in the air at all among the Zionist leaders in 47, 48. They wanted a Jewish majority state, but were willing to accept a state which had 40% Arabs. That's one point. The second thing is the Palestinians may have regarded the land of Palestine as their homeland, but so did the Jews. It was the homeland of the Jews as well. The problem was the Arabs were unable, and remain to this day, unable to recognize that for the Jews, that is their homeland as well. And the problem then is, how do you share this homeland? Either with one binational state or separate this, partitioned into two states. The problem is that the Arabs have always rejected both of these ideas. The homeland belongs to the Jews, as Jews feel, as much as it does, if not more, than for the Arabs.
Jews.
I would say for the Jews. It's the Jewish people's
I would also,
homeland.
real quick, I just want for both of you guys, because I haven't heard these questions answered. I really want these questions to be. I'm just so curious how to make sense of them. It was correctly brought up that I believe that Ben-Gurion had, I think Shlomo Ben-Ami describes it as an obsession with getting validation or support from Western states, Great Britain, and then a couple decades later,
that explains the Suez War.
Yeah, exactly, correct. That was one of the major motivators, the idea to work with Britain and France on a military operation.
Imperial stooge.
But then the question again I go back to, if that is true, if Ben-Gurion, if the early Israel saw themselves as a Western fashion nation, how could we possibly imagine that they would have engaged in the transfer of some 400,000 Arabs after accepting the partition plan? Would that not have completely and totally destroyed their legitimacy in the eyes of the entire Western world?
No.
Would it not have been? How not?
Well, first of all, I think that Zionist leadership's acceptance of the partition resolution, and I think you may have written about this, that they accepted it because it provided international endorsement of the legitimacy of the principle of Jewish statehood, and they didn't accept the borders. And in fact, later expanded the borders. Second of all,
the borders were expanded in war.
They accepted the UN partition resolution, borders and all.
They accepted.
You can say that some of the Zionists, deep in their hearts, had the idea that maybe at some point they would be able to get more.
Including their most senior leaders who said so, and I think you've quoted them
but
saying
they grudgingly accepted what the United Nations, the world community,
Yes.
had said, this is what you're going to get.
And second of all, I mean, removing darker people, it's
Jews are as dark.
it's
In
intrinsic.
Israel,
It's
in Israel,
intrinsic.
Jews are as dark as Arabs.
It's intrinsic to
nonsense.
Western history. So the idea that Americans or Brits or the French would have an issue with, I mean, the French had been doing it in Algeria for decades. The Americans have been doing it in North America for centuries. So how would Israel forcibly displacing Palestinians somehow besmirch Israel in the eyes of the West?
Even in the 1944 resolution of the Labour Party, and at the time, even Bertrand Russell was a member of the Labour Party, it endorsed transfer of Arabs out of Palestine. As Muin's pointed out, that was a deeply entrenched idea in Western thinking, that there was nothing, it doesn't in any way contradict or violate or breach any moral values to displace the Palestinian population. Now, I do believe there's a legitimate question. Had it been the case, as you said, Professor Morris, that the Zionists wanted to create a happy state with a Jewish majority, but a large Jewish minority, and if by virtue of immigration, like in our own country, given the current trajectories, non-whites will become the majority population in the United States quite soon. And according to democratic principles, we have to accept that. So if that were the case, I would say maybe there's an argument that had there been mass Jewish immigration, changed the demographic balance in Palestine, and therefore Jews became the majority. You can make an argument in the abstract that the indigenous Arab population
Isn't it? He's now speaking about a hypothetical. What would have happened if this would have been the case, that in the future, even if they had an Arab minority and there was immigration, would this have happened and that have happened? And that's the same way they're speaking about 47 and 48 and the Zionist enterprise and what the Zionists hypothetically wanted and all this kind of stuff. And that is really the difference between Benny Morris's conversation and Norman Finkelstein's conversation, is that Benny Morris is able to state what happened and why it happened because it is part of reality and a historical fact. And they are basing their arguments not off what happened or why it happened, but on a bunch of hypotheticals. They're saying they're relying their evidence on Zionism. It was inbuilt into Zionism to have this. What happens if there would have been Arab immigration into the state with a Jewish minority? Well, we don't know what would have happened in that case because it never happened, because the Arabs of Palestine rejected partition and waged a war. So I think that this is a very important thing to note in this conversation. And while Finkelstein and Rabbani have brought up points that are factual throughout here and there, all of the kind of through thread narrative of what they're relying on are hypotheticals. What happened? What would have happened if? What would have happened if? So they're making argumentation, but they're not actually delivering a factual analysis of how the events played out. Because if they had to, as you can see displayed by Finkelstein, by Morris, it wouldn't really work out with the narrative in which they're trying to present.
Yeah, well,
population should have been accepting of that, just as whites in the United States, quote unquote whites, have to be accepting of the fact that the demographic majority is shifting to non-whites in our own country. But that's not what Zionism was about. I did write my doctoral dissertation on Zionism, and I don't want to get now bogged down in abstract ideas. But as I suspect you know, most theorists of nationalism say there are two kinds of nationalism. One is a nationalism based on citizenship. You become a citizen, you're integral to the country. That's sometimes called political nationalism. And then there's another kind of nationalism, and that says the state should not belong to its citizens, it should belong to an ethnic group. Each ethnic group should have its own state. It's usually called the German Romantic idea of nationalism. Zionism is squarely in the German Romantic idea. That was the whole point of Zionism. We don't want to be Bundists and be one more ethnic minority in Russia. We don't want to become citizens and just become a Jewish people in England or France. We want our own state.
Like the Arab 23 states.
No, wait. Before we get to the Arabs, let's stick to the Jews for a moment, or the Zionists. We want our own state, and in that concept of wanting your own state, the minority at best lives on sufferance, and at worst gets expelled. That's the logic of the German Romantic Zionist idea of a state. That's why they're Zionists. Now, I personally have shied away from using the word Zionism ever since I finished my doctoral dissertation, because
Was that painful?
Because as I said, I don't believe it's the operative ideology today. It's like talking about Bolshevism and referring to Khrushchev. I doubt Khrushchev could have spelled Bolshevik. But for the period we're talking about, they were Zionists. They were committed to their exclusive state with a minority living on sufferance or at worst expelled. That was their ideology. And I really feel there's a problem with your happy vision of these Western Democrats like Weizmann, and they wanted to live peacefully with the Arabs. Weizmann described the expulsion in 1948 as, quote, the miraculous clearing of the land. That doesn't sound like somebody shedding too many tears at the loss of the indigenous population.
Let me respond to the word unsufferance. The unsufferance I don't agree with. I think that's wrong. Mm-hmm. The Jewish state came into being in 1948. It had a population which was 20% Arab when it came into being. After Arab refugees, many of them had become refugees, but 20% remained in the country. 20% of Israel's population at inception in 1949 was Arab.
80% went missing.
No. We're talking about what remained in Palestine, Israel, after it was created. The 20% who lived in Israel received citizenship and all the rights of Israelis, except, of course, the right to serve in the army, which they didn't want to. and they have Supreme Court justices, they have Knesset members. They enjoy
they lived under emergency laws until 1966
for a period. Sure, they lived under.
So they didn't immediately have citizenship.
No. Wait a second.
This is
At the beginning, it's not fantasy. At the beginning, they received citizenship, could vote in elections for their own people, and they were put into parliament. But in the first years, the Israeli, the Jewish majority suspected that maybe the Arabs would be disloyal because they had just tried to destroy the Jewish state. Then they dropped the military government and they became fully equal citizens. So if the whole idea was they must have a state without Arabs, this didn't happen in 49, and it didn't happen in the
then why did you say, Professor Morris,
yes,
then why did you say without a population expulsion, a Jewish state would not have been established?
Because you're missing the first section of that paragraph, which was that they were being assaulted by the Arabs. And as a result, a Jewish state could not have come into being unless there had also been an expulsion of the population which was trying to kill them.
Norm, I'm officially forbidding you referencing that. Again, hold on a second, wait. We responded to it. So the main point you're making, we have to take Benny at his word, is like there was a war, and that's the reason why he made that statement.
I think that just one last point on this. I remember reading your book when it first came out, and reading, one incident after the other, and one example after the other, and then getting to the conclusion where you said the Nakba was a product of war, not design. I think and I remember reacting almost in shock to that I felt you had mobilized overwhelming evidence that it was a product of design, not war. And I think our discussion today very much reflects, let's say, the dissonance between the evidence and the conclusion. You don't feel that the research that you have conducted and published demonstrates that it was in fact inherent and inbuilt and inevitable. And I think the point that Norm and I are making is that your own historical research, together with that of others, indisputably demonstrates that it does. I think that's a fundamental disagreement we're having here.
Can I actually respond to that? Because this is actually, I think this is emblematic of the entire conversation. I watched a lot of Norm's interviews and conversations in preparation for this, and I hear Norm will say this all over and over and over again. I only deal in facts. I don't deal in hypotheticals. I only deal in facts. I only deal in facts. And that seems to be the case, except for when the facts are completely and totally contrary to the particular point you're trying to push. The idea that Jews would have out of hand rejected any state that had Arabs on it or always had a plan of expulsion is just betrayed by the acceptance of the 47 partition
I don't think you understand politics. Did I just say that there is a chasm that separates your ideology from the limits and constraints imposed by politics and reality? Now, Professor Morris, I suspect, would agree that the Zionist movement from fairly early on was committed to the idea of a Jewish state. I am aware of only one major study, probably written 40 years ago, the binational idea in mandatory Palestine by a woman. I forgot her name now. You remember her.
I'm trying to.
Yeah, okay, but you know the book.
I think so.
Yeah, she is the only one who tried to persuasively argue that the Zionist movement was actually, not formally, actually committed to the binational idea. But most historians of the subject agree the Zionist movement was committed to the idea of a Jewish state. Having written my doctoral dissertation on the topic, I was confirmed in that idea because Professor Chomsky, who was my closest friend for about 40 years, was very committed to the idea that binationalism was the dominant trend in Zionism. I couldn't go with him there. But Professor Morris, you are aware that until the Biltmore Resolution in 1942, the Zionist movement never declared it was for a Jewish state. Why? Because it was politically impossible at the moment until 1942. There's your ideology, there are your convictions, there are your operative plans, and there's also separately what you say in public. The Zionist movement couldn't say in public, we're expelling all the Arabs. They can't say that. And they couldn't even say we support a Jewish state until 1942.
You're conflating two things. The Zionists wanted a Jewish state, correct? That didn't mean
mean
expulsion of the Arabs.
yeah.
It's not the same thing. They wanted a Jewish state with a Jewish majority, but they were willing, as it turned out, both in 37 and in 47, and subsequently, to have an Arab minority, a large Arab minority. They were willing to have a large Arab minority in the country, and they ended up with a large Arab minority in the country. 20% of the population in 49 is Arab, and it's still.
They ended up for about 5 minutes before they were expelled. They agreed to it until 47, and then they were gone by March 1949.
What happened in between the rejection of the partition plan and the expulsion of the Arabs?
The Arabs launched the war.
Well, yeah, well, I mean, it wasn't random. Like, there's a potential that
It wasn't random. I totally agree with that.
Yeah,
It was by design.
You can say that, but in this case, the facts betray you. There was no Arab acceptance of anything that would have allowed for a Jewish state to exist. Number one, and number two, I think that it's entirely possible, given how things happen after war, that this exact same conflict could have played out and an expulsion would have happened without any ideology at play. That there was a people that disagreed on who had territorial rights to a land. There was a massive war afterwards, and then a bunch of their friends invaded after to reinforce the idea that the Jewish people in this case couldn't have a state. There could have been a transfer regardless.
Anything could have been. That's not what history is about.
History is about Palestinian rejection to any peace.
It's interesting that he says that, because he keeps making the point about what Zionism was, even though it wasn't in practice, and then he makes a statement about history is not what could have happened. But that's what he's been doing for the last hour, is it not?
That's exactly what he's doing. That's hilarious.
I mean, an hour and 23 minutes in, I think anyone objectively, look, I mean, even if you're like a viewer is anti-Israel or whatever, can objectively turn around and say that Finkelstein has been playing hypotheticals for a majority of the time that he's been speaking about, and then he brings across this kind of statement about history is not about what could have happened.
And it's so ironic. Destiny is saying, what do you think happened in that period of time to cause the expulsion? There was a war, genius.
Well, this is usually what happens around about talking about the 2000 peace accords as well. You hear about Palestinians will speak about Oslo, and then they'll mention Rabin's suicide, and then they'll go on to the second Intifada. But they'll leave out the point where Barak offered a two-state solution to the Palestinians alongside Clinton that went further than anything Rabin was, as what was recorded. Who knows what would play out in practice, but as what was recorded at the time before his death, he was willing to offer certain things. Barak's proposal actually went further than what Rabin was willing to do, but that is completely left out of the discussion, because the minute you say, well, the Palestinians reject the exact thing you're calling for in that time, you have to skip over 47 to 49 if you want to speak about the displacement. You can mention partition, but then you have to link the partition with displacement, and you cannot acknowledge the civil war or the subsequent regional war.
Yeah, that's so true.
As I
again.
said, when the ball was thrown into the court of the United Nations, they were faced with a practical problem. And I, for one, am not going to try to adjudicate the rights and wrongs from the beginning. I do not believe that if territorial displacement and dispossession was inherent in the Zionist project, I do not believe it can be a legitimate political enterprise. Now, you might say that's speaking from 2022 or 2024 now. Okay, but we have to recognize that from nearly the beginning, for perfectly obvious reasons, having nothing to do with anti-Semitism, anti-Westernism, anti-Europeanism, but because no people that I am aware of would voluntarily cede its country. You can perfectly understand Native American resistance to Eurocolonialism. You can perfectly well understand it without any anti-Europeanism, anti-whiteism, anti-Christianism. They didn't want to cede their country to invaders. That's completely understandable.
You're minimizing the anti-Semitic element in Arab nationalism.
All your books you minimized.
No. Husseini was an anti-Semite. The leader of the Palestinian national movement in the 30s and 40s was an anti-Semite. This was one of the things which drove him, and also drove him in the end to work in Berlin for Hitler for 4 years, with giving Nazi propaganda to the Arab world, calling on the Arabs to murder the Jews. That's what he did in World War II. That's the leader of the Palestinian Arab national movement.
Why is it,
and he wasn't alone.
Why is it that if you read your book, Righteous Victims, you can read it and read it and read it and read it, as I have, you will find barely a word about the Arabs being motivated by anti-Semitism.
It exists, though.
I didn't say it doesn't exist.
You agree that it exists.
Hey, I don't know a single non-Jew who doesn't harbor anti-Semitic
We're
sentiment.
talking about Arabs now.
Yeah, but I don't know anybody. That's just part of the human condition.
Anti-Semitism.
Husseini was a fourth
and among the Arabs.
So, Professor Mark.
That's wild. Did you hear that? He's a Jew pretty much saying that everyone hates Jews. Like everybody.
And part of the human condition.
But the thing is I don't know what he really means by that. Is he blaming us for that, or is he just saying that that's a fact of life? That's what I'm trying to understand. Like what he really means by that statement.
The Holocaust industry, you'll have your answer.
Here's my problem. I didn't see that in your Righteous Victims. Even when you talked about the first Intifada, and you talked about the second Intifada, and you talked about how there was a lot of influence by Hamas, the Islamic movement, you even stated that there was a lot of anti-Semitism in those movements, but then you went on to say, but of course, at bottom, it was about the occupation. It wasn't about, and I've read it.
Yeah, you're moving from different
I'm not moving.
ages, across
I'm
the ages.
About your whole book.
The occupation began in 67, the one we're talking about.
I looked for evidence of this anti-Semitism as being a chief motor of Arab resistance to Zionism. I didn't see it.
Did he make that claim?
I don't remember the word chief.
Yeah,
it's one of the elements.
Very binary.
It's one of the elements.
Binary.
Yes, binary.
Please don't give me this postmodernism binary. You're the
But
one.
you are thinking in terms of black and
that
white.
said the chief motor. Do you have your book here?
Talk about
page
black,
137.
You talk in black and white.
Page 37.
You're talking in black and white concepts when history is much grayer. Lots of things happen because of lots of reasons, not one or the other. And you don't seem to see that.
Can I ask you a question? Because it's for them to talk to. Just a very quick question. What do you think the ideal solution was on the Arab side from 47? What would they have preferred? And what would have happened if, and then the second one, what would have happened if Jews would have lost the war in 48? What do you think would have happened to the Israeli population?
I think the Palestinians and the Arabs were explicit that they wanted a unitary, I think, federal state, and they made their submissions to UNSCOP. They made their appeals at the UN General Assembly.
What do you mean by unitary and federal? I don't get that. They wanted an Arab state. They wanted Palestine to be an Arab state.
Yes, yes.
But that's the word unitary, federal. They wanted Palestine as an Arab and exclusively Arab state.
No, it wasn't an exclusively Arab state. I think we have to distinguish between Palestinian and Arab opposition to a Jewish state in Palestine on the one hand, and Palestinian and Arab attitudes to Jewish existence in Palestine. There's a fundamental difference.
Husseini, the leader of the movement, said that all the Jews who had come since 1917, and that's the majority of the Jews in Palestine in 1947,
Yes.
shouldn't be there.
Well, he
They
did
shouldn't be
say
citizens and they shouldn't be there.
He did say that.
I'm not denying it. It's true. I can understand the sentiment, but I think it's wrong.
But also, you guys use the word earlier that it was supremacy and exclusivity that the Zionists
I want to answer your question. As you, Husseini did say that, and I'm sure there was a very substantial body of Palestinian Arab public opinion.
By the way, I understand that the Arabs didn't want us to have the land. I get them for that. You know, like the Jews came back after thousands of years. Hey guys, I get that. But when you don't have your own state and then you want to fight us, listen, all's fair in love and war, guys. I understand. Meaning, I can get it. I can wrap my head around it. It's just like what's his name? Rabbani is making it as if that's not even the case.
Yeah.
That endorsed that. But by the same token, I think a unitary Arab state, as you call it, or a Palestinian state, could have been established with arrangements, with guarantees to ensure the security and rights of both communities. How that would work in detail had been discussed and proposed, but never resolved. And again, I think, you know, Jewish fears about what would have happened.
Second Holocaust. That's what.
Well, no, I think
that was the Jewish fear. A second Holocaust.
That may well have been the Jewish fear. It was an unfounded Jewish fear.
It was unfounded?
Of course, it was unfounded.
What about like in 48 and 56?
You really think that the Palestinians, had they won the war, were going to import ovens and crematoria from Germany?
But there were programs across in almost every single Arab state where there were Jews living after 48, after 56, after 67. There were always pogroms. There were always flights from Jews from those countries to Israel afterwards. I don't think it would be.
I wouldn't say there.
We gotta stop it. It's 4:18. I just want to. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I've got you. I'm just thinking, it's just so interesting to me how the narrative that's presented here is very similar. I wrote an article recently called Unmasking the New York Times Israel-Palestine Distortions. And the narrative that Rabbani is presenting is very similar to the issues that I see in that. Anyone who wants to read it, it's there on my Substack, which you mentioned earlier. But the kind of drift of the conversation is that, you know, the innocent Arabs of Palestine kind of just sat back and watched as helpless victims, as the Zionists, Israel, and some international actors did their worst. And it's just not true. I mean, there were pogroms going in already on the 20s and the 30s. So far before the establishment of the State of Israel, the pogroms against the Jews, you know, violent riots and massacres of local Jewish populations. So to really just brush over that as if it's of no consequence to the events that would later unfold, I think is naive at best and probably malicious at worst.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if Rabbani was part of Hamas, he would define their charter. If they were up on a podium and the violent parts or the violent guys in the Hamas leadership were saying, "We are going to murder them," he'd say, hey, we're not going to kill them. We're just going to put them to sleep, guys. Okay,
well, I think he's more accurately, I think he's representative of the Palestinian Authority, actually, because when you listen to Hamas, they're actually brutally honest about what they say, and the Palestinian Authority are also actually quite honest about what they say, as Rabbani has clearly stipulated that he thinks the idea of any sort of Jewish, the establishment of any sort of Jewish state in any part of the land is illegitimate. That's kind of the underlying substrata of all the things that he's saying. But he's far more diplomatic in the way in which he presents it. But he would be a first-class Palestinian Authority politician, in my view. Because he's able to sit here and have a very diplomatic conversation. But essentially the point that he's making is precisely, you know, Hamas's belief that a Jewish state in any part of the land is illegitimate in and of itself. So, you know.
Yeah,
that's where we are now.
That is very true. Okay, are we wrapping up just this part, right? You got to run now.
this part up, and then we'll continue for part two.
Okay,
Part,
awesome.
yeah, we
Awesome
do.
sauce. Ladies and gents, sorry we have to cut it short. I would have at least liked to do half. Listen, Sam is a busy man. He's got to catch a flight. I very much appreciate you taking the time thus far. Hopefully, in the second part, we'll be able to finish the rest of it. It is quite a long debate, so I hope you guys can manage with your attention spans. If you have to watch it, what I always say, guys, is if you can't sit for 5-6 hours, I don't expect you to give it that much time directly. Watch it in spurts. Watch an hour at a time. Watch a half hour at a time. This is going to be, I think, the first. I don't think anyone else has done a breakdown on YouTube of this particular debate for the complete 5 hours. So we are here to make it happen. Sam, thanks for coming, guys. Always make sure like, subscribe, and share. Tune in for the next episode. I'm not exactly sure if I'm going to put it out in the next few days, by next Tuesday. It also depends on Sam's availability. So make sure to stay tuned for part 2. Leave your comments, leave your feedback. I really look forward to it. And we will see you on the next episode. Alrighty.
Alrighty.
Use that.
Good. That was good.